Hi, so welcome everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to one event that we've organised as the Early Career Research Committee from HESG. So today we're looking to have 4 presenters for our topic on publishing journal articles as an early career health economist, and we have 4 speakers today. So we would today you'll obviously I'd like to thank the Health Foundation has given us funding to form the committee, and they've helped us along with getting the license for Zoom. So today the plan is we'll have the 4 speakers will each do their presentations, and then we'll try and save the time at the end for questions, obviously, because my question might be useful for all 4 panel members to respond. You're welcome to either put items into the chat that myself and James can then relay to the panel members, or then ask questions yourself. This event is being recorded, so will be made available on the Early Career Research YouTube channel after the event. So the first presentation we have is Chris Carswell. So Chris is from PharmacoEconomics. Is currently a member of the International Society of PharmacoEconomics and Outcomes and the Research Task Force on Health Economics Publication Guidelines, is a member of the World Association of Medical Editors and the International Health Economics Association. He's the editor of PharmacoEconomics since 2004 and is the co-editor of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research and the consulting editor of Applied Health Economics and Health Policy. So over to Chris. And
okay, I'll see if I can just
Julia.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, you...
So can everybody see the slides? Are they working?
Yep, all good.
Yep.
All good. Okay. Thanks very much, Luke, and thank you for the invitation to present. I'm in addition to the journals that Luke mentioned, I'm also have some management responsibilities as Springer. So I actually manage about 10 editors-in-chief that all have their own journals around in the pharmacy and pharmacology field as well. So, okay. So this is the journal that I've been the editor-in-chief for since 2004. It's one of the pioneering journals in the field. Hopefully that quite a lot of you have heard of the journal. Launched in 1992. Its primary focus is the economic evaluation of drug interventions and also other healthcare interventions. We publish all sorts of different types of content. The journal is indexed in all the major databases. And it's a hybrid journal, so the content is submitted, so the content is published behind a paywall unless you pay for an open access fee. And it's in the first quartile of all its relevant categories with the impact factor. So in terms of what I want to say about how to enhance your success in terms of getting papers published, I like to talk about 3 steps to success, to publication success. And for me, they are having an impactful paper. And by that, I mean having either a research topic that has the potential to have impact, having authors that have a track history of publishing papers that are well received, downloaded, or highly cited, but also having a clear, impactful message. I'll talk a little bit about those. Then also making sure that you choose your journal wisely and don't just use some sort of algorithm such as impact factor, and observing some key rules around good publication practice and ethics. So in terms of what I think of as an impactful research topic, I'm looking for papers that have the potential to inform real-world decision-making, papers that have the potential to advance methods or practices, and also papers that have the ability to facilitate knowledge and learning, so tutorial pieces. And in fact, in PharmacoEconomics, some of those tutorial pieces are generally the most well received. Off the top of my head, I can think of an Ed Wilson paper on a value of information, a couple of papers we've published on transition probabilities, and then in the patient journal, I can one on sample size estimation, discrete choice experiments by Esther Debecker-Grob, really well received. So a paper for me needs to come into one of those three categories. We've seen that over the years, and I'll be interested to see what my colleagues have to say. We've seen a vast increase in the number of papers being published year on year, and to the point of, we're doing a lot more desk rejects. So we really are looking at the very early stage before we send something to peer review, whether it falls into one of these categories. I mentioned impactful authors and institutions, and that can also have a little bit of an effect on an editor's decision whether to send a paper to review. And I did this quick search here on the Clarivate database. That's the database that is used to estimate the impact factor, just to find out who are the authors that have cited most in our field. And I'm sure some of the names there at the bottom wouldn't be too much of a surprise to you there. And we can do the same in terms of institutions. So Harvard University, University of Oxford, there, Johns Hopkins University. All these institutions have a track record of publishing papers, or their authors publishing papers that have the potential to cite well. And I think no matter what editors tell you, and certainly within Springer Nature, the impact factor and citing is a big thing. It's a big metric in terms of the way that the success of a journal is assessed, together with downloads. So you can have an impactful topic, and you can have some good authors, but if the paper is not written well, if the paper is full of jargon, or it's overly long and verbose, then really you can actually ruin your chances of getting published. So I like to think of papers needing to be written concisely. They need to be written clearly, as I said. And this is something I think that early career researchers sometimes fall down on. It's actually quite hard to write a paper well, and you can often pick out what papers that have come from a PhD thesis, because the introduction is 6 or 7 pages long. There's often a lot of jargon in there as well. So that's and as an editor, if I can't get through the introduction without sort of my attention waning, then that's not a very good sign for the paper. And this just in pharmacy joke from my clinical pharmacy background experience, if you can't understand the paper, then really you've lost the impact altogether. So in my view, top tips for writing clearly, I would look at similar papers in the journal. So before you submit to a particular journal, have a look at similar papers, see how they've been written. Ask a colleague who has not been involved in your particular study to read the paper and to say how clearly they think it's written and whether they can actually understand the messages. Use recognized reporting checklists. Time and time again, we often either desk reject papers or send them back to the authors for further changes, because there's inadequate detail to allow good review. The methods are inadequately reported. So use reporting checklists. There are some well-recognized, well-accepted checklists out there. PRISMA for systematic reviews, CHEERS for economic evaluations, Consort. Use them as an aid before you submit a paper. And finally, remember that an abstract is like a shop window. Take time to make sure that the abstract is fully reported as well. That's often another common error in my view. This is some good tips on how to structure papers. I won't go through them, but the reference is down at the bottom there, and there's some good tips here, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at this paper. So you might have an impactful paper, it's really well written, but then you fall down in terms of selecting a journal. Either you aim to the top, you aim for the BMJ, you aim for the New England Journal of Medicine or Health Economics, Journal of Health Economics, and you get kicked back. And then, so it's really important to match the paper with the journal, and otherwise you can end up with delays. Sometimes we get systematic reviews that have, the last search date was 2018, 2017. And when you dig deeper into it, it's because the paper's been rejected from a number of journals previously. So choose your journal wisely. And it's actually quite complicated because there's a lot of differences between journals in terms of their publishing model, whether they're open access, fully open access, or hybrid, the copyright license that they operate under, their publication policies, the journal metrics, including time to first decision, download, citations, etc. Whether the journal is affiliated with a society or not, whether they have, like my journal, full-time editors on staff or not, whether journals operate cascades. So, for example, in the portfolio of my journals, if a paper is not suitable for pharmacoeconomics, it can often be suitable for one of the journals within our portfolio, and then that would save you actually going through the submission process right from scratch. And also whether the journal has a social media presence as well. I think that can also help promote your paper. So all those things really need to be taken into consideration. And one of the top tips I think for me is in terms of choosing a journal is that once you've written the paper, go and have a look at your reference list and look at some of the journals that occur most often. And that might give you a clue as to the most appropriate journal to submit your paper to. Not all journals encourage preliminary inquiries or pre-submission inquiries. My portfolio of journals do. That's probably because we've got full-time staff, editorial staff who can actually take the time to read drafts. But it can save you some time in the long run, and we can often tell you pretty quickly whether we would entertain a paper. And I think we're always mindful of the fact that it's quite an onerous submission process these days with all the questions you have to ask. So certainly with my portfolio of journals, we do encourage you to send informal inquiries. But do make sure that if you do, that you do actually structure the email properly, make sure it's grammatically correct, and actually tell us why you think your paper is going to be interesting to the journal, and not do as this poor soul did, and in terms of poor grammar and really telling us nothing in terms of the paper. And that also brings me on to the cover letter. I like to think of a cover letter as very much like a cover letter to a CV. You really need to sell your paper. Don't just reiterate the abstract in the cover letter or what's in the paper. Sell it to the journal. Why is it important? Why should we consider your paper? Make sure it's grammatically correct. Make sure that there are no errors in the cover letter as well. I have, believe it or not, had this a few times where clearly they haven't taken the time to actually amend the journal. And that really just tells me that perhaps not a lot of care has been taken in the rest of the paper. Unfortunately, with so many papers submitted these days, I think sometimes editors get into the mindset of looking for reasons to reject papers, purely because of the quantity we receive. And that would certainly be a signal for me that perhaps due care and attention hasn't been taken in the paper. And also avoid shopping around. And by that I mean, if you've submitted to a paper and you've got some reviews and your paper gets rejected, make sure that you take time to address those comments before you submit to another journal. We live in quite a small field, and it's not unusual for us to send papers out inadvertently or not knowingly to the reviewers who saw the paper at a previous journal. And this is an actual response I got from one reviewer who was pretty peeved that the authors had made no attempt to actually revise the paper between submissions. And one of the pre-submission questions that we ask now is, has this paper been submitted previously elsewhere, and will you provide us with the peer review comments? And it's one of the reasons is to try and get around this issue. But finally, I just want to touch on 3 publication ethics issues that we find are quite common. Self-plagiarism. So this is quite a common error that I come across, particularly in systematic reviews where authors have perhaps just lifted sentences from the original papers. Do take care not to do that, and to try and reword the paper as best you can. Authorship requirements. Guest authorship is something that often comes across my desk as an issue. People complaining that authors haven't quite reached the requirements for authorship. So do take care to look at what the requirements are for authorship, and make sure that you do fulfill all those criteria. And the final point I want to make is around intellectual conflicts of interest. I think as a field, we're probably pretty good at declaring obvious financial conflicts of interest, but I think we're probably pretty poor at declaring intellectual conflicts of interest. And I have a few current issues across my desk where people are, readers are threatening legal action, etc., because authors have not fully declared their intellectual conflicts of interest. So that's an important thing to consider. And I guess my final point really is get it right first time. The more effort you spend in terms of getting a paper the best it can be before you submit it, and spending time ensuring that you choose the correct journal, do your research on that, and ask colleagues, the more that successful you will be in terms of getting a paper published first time. So that's all I've got to say.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. We'll plan is to try and get the next presentations, and then we'll just save questions at the end. But if everyone's got any questions, when we do get to the sessions at the end, you can have a raise your hand, or you can ask via the chat function, and I'll make a log of this and then start to ask those questions. So we'll move on to the next presentation. So the next presenter is Professor Joanna Coast from Social Science and Medicine. So Joanna Coast is a professor in the economics and health and care at the University of Bristol. She's published in numerous papers in the role and implementation of qualitative methods in health economics, and as one of her main research areas is the end of life care. Jo's a senior editor for health economics, social science and medicine, and is the chair of the scientific committee for the International Health Economics Association Congress, IHEA, in 2021. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you. I'll just try and share my screen. Is that okay? Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you. So yes, so I'm one of the 2 editors, health economics editors for social science and medicine. And I'm just going to go through the 3 questions that we were asked to comment on. And I think a lot of what I say will be very similar to what Chris has said, although there are some differences as well. So this is the aims and scope for social science and medicine, and it's quite long. And I often think these things are a little bit boring, and you look at them and you think, oh, do I need to look at them? But actually they are quite important in terms of that decision about which journal you should submit to. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So social science and medicine has 2 health economics editors, me and Richard Smith. And we also have a statement about the papers that we consider within the health economics office. So that statement is that we will consider papers that concentrate on the allocation of scarce resources in relation to health, Papers may use quantitative or qualitative methods alongside economic or other theory, or explore theoretical issues, as long as the focus is health and resource allocation. Papers using econometric methods to explore questions unrelated to resource allocation are not considered suitable for the Health Economics Office. So that's one of the things that we get quite a lot of, is econometric papers that are basically asking epidemiological questions. And then with those sorts of papers, probably the Health Economics Office is not the right place to go within social science and medicine. There is a social epidemiology office. We have about 500 submissions annually to the Health Economics Office, and that's rising. So again, I would emphasize what Chris says about how important it is to make your paper look right for the office. Papers get randomly assigned to me and Rich unless there's a conflict of interest, and our stats on decisions are almost identical, so it really doesn't matter who you get in terms of the editor. So in terms of the review process, the paper is evaluated initially by the Health Economics editor against this question of scope, and that's where I want to come back to that initial statement about what social science and medicine publishes. So the first thing we think about is it in scope in terms of, is it social science? So social science and medicine is about the dissemination of social science of research, areas of common interest to social sciences, scientists, a range of social science disciplines. So first of all, is it a social science paper? If it's really a clinical paper, it's probably not the right journal. Second thing, is it about health fundamentally? So we publish papers on health issues relevant to any aspect of health, physical, mental health, clinical practice, health policy and organisation, but it has to be sufficiently health related. And the third thing is it general and international interest? So I think this is perhaps one of the areas where we diverge a little bit from some of the other journals here, because we're interested in papers that are of interest to a general international readership within social sciences. So anything that is very, very technically economics-y is, again, probably not suitable for social science and medicine. In terms of the review process, we also evaluate against quality and policy issues. So I'm going to cover those under common mistakes. And as Chris said, papers may be rejected without review, and currently our reject without review rate from the Health Economics Office is about 70%. So it is important to make sure that your paper is the right sort of paper. And our mean times from submission to first decision is around 20 days. And that includes the reject without reviews and the other papers that do go out to review. So in terms of the review process, following the review, which is usually around 2 months, you'll either get a reject or a revised decision. When papers are resubmitted, we generally send them for re-review unless very minor changes are requested. So it's quite unusual for it not to go out to re-review. Following re-review, you'll either get an accept or another round of revisions, and overall about 15% of all submissions to the Health Economics Office at SSM are accepted, and the average time to accept is around 6 months. Appeals is an interesting issue. I would say only if there's a valid reason, but editors aren't infallible, as I've recently found out with another journal, and do appeal if you think there's an issue. So in terms of what makes a good paper, so when I started as a researcher, my boss had 2 rules for papers, and I've actually carried them through my career. And the first of his rules was every paper needs a peg to hang it on. And I think it's really important that you're clear about what the research gap is that's being filled and what research question you're addressing. You need to have a phrase somewhere in your paper that says something like, this paper aims to, or the hypothesis tested in this paper is, because if you're not clear about what your paper is about, then the editor won't be clear about that either. I think the second thing that my first boss said to me is, one paper, 1 point. So I would really try to avoid a paper that has a sort of phrase like this. This paper looks at performance-based financing in terms of its influence on waiting times. It also considers whether it's popular among stakeholders. It also questions whether it can lead to some health centres shutting down. Finally, it asks whether it's feasible to measure the outcome of performance-based financing schemes. It's just too much, and your paper needs to be really clear in what it's trying to bring across. Also, avoid writing a report rather than a paper. And again, sort of picking up on what what Chris said, avoid trying to cram an 80,000 word thesis into one paper. And a tip I would give people who are writing from their thesis is to start with a blank page and pull information in from your thesis to make your paper, rather than starting with a chapter and trying to get rid of things, because it's always much harder to get rid of the precious words that you've already written than it is to put new words in. Make the contribution of your paper clear. So how does your work advance the literature? What sort of contribution is it making? Is it really innovative, or is it more supporting previous work? Are the findings of general interest or of interest to a specific group? And all of those are fine, but it comes down again to what Chris was saying about identifying the right journal. And just to sort of draw on some common mistakes, or some of them are common, some are less common. So I think, again, it's emphasising the writing issues. It's about making the research gap clear, not trying to do too many things in one paper, and making the contribution clear. Common mistakes are to not do those things. Excuse me. I would also say poor presentation is very off-putting for an editor and also for a reviewer. Really proofread. And also try to avoid having a really poor discussion that basically just repeats the findings. You need to, I actually think social science and medicine doesn't require a structured discussion, but I actually think using one of the structures that there are as a basis for your discussion is a good way forward. So again, not choosing carefully enough, I think, is a common mistake. So like I've said, read what the scope of the journal is, look at the sorts of papers that are published in the journal. Also, once you get to the journal and you've chosen your journal, for some journals, you also need to choose the right editorial office. So that might be within a health economics journal where the editors have specific knowledge, or it might be within SSM where you're about choosing between health economics, health policy, social epidemiology, and so on. So do read what sorts of papers the editors are interested in. As social science and medicine, we do reassign papers, but I would say you're probably more likely to get a reject without review if you submit it to the wrong office, just because the editor may not recognise the value of your work. And I've already mentioned about econometric methods. I think another common mistake is to not be aware of journal policies. So I'm just going to highlight some of the journal policies for SSM. So for SSM, it is journal policy not to consider submissions which have been made available via a preprint server or as working papers prior to submission. And that's mainly because it inhibits the possibility of double-blind review, which is the standard that we work to. But it is something that causes concern with economists particularly. I think they fall into this trap more than those in other social sciences. A second one, and one of the banes of my life, is that all work with human subjects needs ethic approval or formal exemption. This is, again, another one where economists, particularly, I think economists who work in economics departments, are more likely to fall down than those who work in sort of healthcare. So it doesn't have to be health related to need ethics approval. If you're doing a DCE, if you're doing a willingness to pay survey with members of the general public, it needs to have ethics approval. And something I found out a couple of years ago, the only humans who don't count apparently are politicians, because they've put themselves in the public domain. The other thing, again, we also, as with Chris, check through authenticate software for potential plagiarism. I think actually properly plagiarised papers, there's probably been 3 in the 10+ years I've been an editor, but poor academic practice is much more common, and you don't want to fall down on that. Another common problem is not engaging with the review process. So it is very difficult to get reviewers. If the journal asks you to suggest reviewers, I would suggest you do. I would also suggest you don't pick the 5 top people in the field, because most of them are already editors for somewhere else and they're likely to say no. And some of them are very helpful and will give suggestions, but not all of them. So try to suggest reviewers maybe who are more sort of mid-career, but experts in your field. Also, don't suggest people who have an @Hotmail or an @Google type address. I won't use those because I don't know who they are. With the review process, when your paper is sent back to you and you're asked to make revisions, ask if you need more time. We standardly give 6 weeks. That's about to change actually to 31 days. But I will almost never say no if you ask for an extension on time. When addressing your review comments, be respectful and engage with the reviewers by doing what they asked mostly, justifying when you don't do what they ask. Make sure that you accept the limitations of your work. All work has limitations, and make the reviewers and editors' lives as easy as possible by making your response as comprehensive as you can. I think another problem or another potential mistake is throwing a paper away if it's rejected. And I think that this is possibly something that is more common with early career researchers, is you put a lot of effort in and then you get something back that is bad for your confidence and you think, I'm just not going to look at this paper again. I think that's a mistake. Rejection happens to everybody, but I think it's the exception that work is really unpublishable. I think I've probably had 2 papers in my whole career that have actually been unpublishable. So I don't throw it away. Think about the comments that you get. Don't dismiss them, because even if they've got it wrong, it might be because you've not explained it well enough. And so I agree with Chris, make revisions before you send it out. If those revisions are good ideas, it'll be a better paper down the line. Excuse me. The question of journals offering a switch to another journal, we do that as well. We do offer that quite often, and there's a journal desk. But I, as an author, I would say think very carefully about whether that's actually the right thing for your paper. I wouldn't necessarily just go with that as an option. Just some final comments. These are some places that might be useful in terms of some of these things around things like writing skills and finding the right journal. These are all from the Elsevier website. Think about becoming a reviewer for the journal. That can help you in terms of seeing what papers look like and just getting more familiar with the general area. And then just a couple of comments really on some of the things that, a couple of things that Chris said that weren't in my presentation. So I would say one thing that we don't do, that I don't do, is look for impactful authors or institutions. That is not something that I would use in a decision about whether to send a paper out for review, or about whether to anything to do with acceptance or rejection. I just would not use that. I agree with Chris about the importance of abstracts, and I agree about looking at reference lists for the papers that are published in the journal. I think that is a good way of knowing whether or not your paper is the right type of paper for the journal that you're submitting to. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. So we will move on now to Bruce, if you're ready, Bruce. So Bruce Hollingsworth is a professor of health economics and leads the health economics group at Lancaster University. His research and international collaborative publications are principally in the area of efficiency measurement with respect to the production of health and healthcare, social determinants of health, and the translation of research into practice. Bruce is the co-editor of Health Economics and the co-organiser of HESG. Bruce also runs the Economics Discussion Forum. So over to you, Bruce.
Hi, Luke. Can you see me okay? The slides, not me.
Try to make it full screen, but I think it is viewable. Yep, that's full screen now.
Okay. Are you still on full screen?
No, it went down.
It's all right. It's a good job I don't get paid to do this, isn't it?
You're full screen
okay.
now.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, the good thing about going third is, of course, I was able to secretly edit my slides and take out the points that other people had said. So I'll try not to be repetitive. So hopefully this will be a little bit shorter, because a lot of this stuff, of course, is similar for a lot of the journals. So I hope that's okay. So as Luke said, I'm a co-editor of Health Economics and have been for a few years. I mean, you can see all this on the website if you go and have a look, but the editor-in-chief is Sally Stearns, Co-editors are Andy Briggs, myself, David Bradford, and Tina Asgir-Statir. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute, but we have health economics letters as well. Now, the health economics letters editors are Dorte Gerda-Hansen, Eleonora Fitzgerald, and Nicole Black, and we have lots of associate editors. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the setup now. Now, the health economics letters aren't letters, so that's a little bit confusing. They're short research papers. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. Research papers are just normal papers. I should say, and following on from what the other Ed said, I think the underlying factor in terms of aims and scope of health economics to bear in mind when you're submitting is it needs to have some economics in it. I think Joe summed it up nicely for social science and medicine. And said there's certain types of papers that we wouldn't publish, so there's no point sending. If you have a look at a few past issues of the journal, you'll see what's in there, and there must be some economics in your paper. It's not for, as Joe said, the epidemiology papers with some econometrics applied to them and different things. It's not for economic evaluations in certain areas, which are very valuable pieces of work, but it's not for that. Okay. Now, also, I should say the health economics letters are concise research articles of 2,000 words. They're not letters. Okay. Now, I didn't name it health economics letters, so maybe, you know, that's obviously a little bit confusing to a lot of people. I have to say, we don't really get many letters, so I don't know whether people have got the hang of that, but there are other journals out there which do similar things. We do publish editorials. We really don't publish very many editorials. And I think especially for early career researchers, it's a big opportunity cost to writing an editorial, in that you're not going to get promoted by writing lots of editorials. You're going to get promoted by publishing lots of papers in high impact journals. We publish special editions, which the other eds didn't talk about, but I don't know whether they do that. But we do that occasionally. We do 1 or 2 a year. There's one coming up on economics and mental health. It's around a workshop, and you could submit to. They often are. You can submit to the workshop, and then the papers are published in a special edition of the journal. For health economics with Wiley, you do have to pay. Wiley have a payment structure for this, which is I think opaque might be the word. It's a few thousand. It's not a horrific amount. If you've got funding for a workshop, you can negotiate with Wiley in advance and get a fee and publish a special edition. It has to, of course, pass muster, and all the papers go out to referees, and it's the same bar that all of the papers get. We also put in early career terms, we publish the IHEA Early Career Researcher Prize paper and the student papers, or they get the offer of publishing their papers. Not all of them accept it. Some have submitted elsewhere. So we do try and work with early career researchers and students as well, PhD students often. A few stats. Now, our board meeting is next week. So I can only give you the stats from the first 6 months because I'm not allowed to tell you what they are. So don't tell anyone, but I'll tell you what they are. So last year, our submission rate, I think all journal submission rates went up a lot last year for lots of reasons. But in 2020, we had 1,000, this is for the first 6 months. So literally you can double these. We had 1,200 submissions in the whole year, which is a big increase over, 700 and odd, which it was going back for a few years. That's being maintained this year. Again, I don't know whether it'll continue in years to come for lots of reasons. We have a distribution of papers submitted, as you can see, across the world, but there are obviously a lot more papers coming from US and Europe and Australia. There are big sources of published papers usually. So we often, it's settled down at about 100 submissions a month. And the acceptance rate's about 15% because we only publish about, 120 different things a year. It's a monthly journal with a few papers in each. But the acceptance rates, so Joe was saying hers is 15%. Ours is probably, lowering a little, slipping a little bit down to 13, 14, just because of the number of submissions. One tip, I think, when you're submitting papers is to look at the acceptance rates of journals. You know, we'd all like papers in the American Economic Review, but they have an acceptance rate of about 3% or probably less now. So you have to think about these things. What's the acceptance rate? You know, what's the practical best way of getting your paper submitted? Now, these are from last year, but I can tell you that that is now about 500,000 in terms of article downloads. I don't think Health Economics publishes any paper copies anymore. So I think we used to publish a few, but they've stopped now and everything is online. But if you think about it, you know, who reads a paper copy of anything anymore? Top downloaded countries kind of correspond with the top countries where papers are published. Obviously, we only publish in English language as well, which is an issue. In terms of international papers, of course. Yeah, so downloaded papers are increasing quite dramatically, no surprise there. Missed one out, countries around the world. Well, again, this kind of just reflects what I was showing you previously. These are, this was provided by Wiley, obviously. You know, this isn't unusual. A lot of our readership is in North America, Europe, and Australia, for some reason Brazil, not sure, who knows. But anyway, so I had another slide, but I deleted it because the others had said most of it, so I'm not going to go on about that. But a few things I just noted down when you were talking there. As I say, there's some good tips from Chris and Joe, I think, about what not to do, which is very important. Don't irritate the editors, okay? Do what you're told on submission. Make the editor's life easy. Okay, we get, you know, 25 papers a week submitted that we have to deal with and read. Okay, we read all of them. Then they go to, if you're lucky and you don't get your 60% of ours are desk rejected. So if you get through that, they go to an associate editor. The associate editors then send out to referees. Normally there'd be 2, sometimes there's 3. So you get the responses from 2 or 3 referees plus an associate editor who'll read it in detail and comment on it as well. Great advice, I think, already been said. Do what you're told when you're asked for to change something or do something. You know, you might not agree with that, and you can justify why you don't agree with that, and that's fine. As Joe said, no one's infallible. But often, you know, the advice is good and you should do it, especially if you've got a chance to resubmit to the journal, but it's also if you're resubmitting to another journal. You know, it's good advice to do what you're told. Okay. And what Chris said, they respond to preliminary inquiries. We don't respond to preliminary inquiries. Okay. So don't expect, if you write to the editors, to get some advice back about whether you should submit your paper. We're certainly not going to read a paper if you send it to us in advance. Okay, we just get too many submissions to deal with that. I think I'd say competition's high, so look at the acceptance rates of journals. Okay, the bar's very high on a lot of journals now. Okay, that shouldn't put you off, but you know, you should bear that in mind when you're thinking about things, because if you send a paper off to, you know, JPE or American Economic Review, it might be away for a year. Okay, that could hold your whole career up by a year, and that's a lot of money and a lot of promotion opportunities missed. Don't salami slice your papers. You know, we do use software which says if papers have been, if chunks of papers have been similarly published elsewhere, and we do find it a lot. You know, papers with 30–40% published elsewhere, so we're going to look at what that is, and that's not what we're about. Okay, that's not the sort of journal where we are. Covering letters. Okay, so if you're going to write one saying, you know, your life story, or here's the paper for the journal, don't bother. You know, give us, if you're writing something to tell us something that's not in the paper, or why your paper should be published because it does something really interesting, that's great, tell us that. But don't just write one for the sake of it, you're wasting your time. Yeah, we do check if things have been published elsewhere. We still do catch people out with that, not as often as we used to, because I think people realise. We do desk check quite quickly, and most journals do now, I think. There are some economics journals which don't, so that can really hold you up. So have a look at the stats online. In response to what Joe just said about selection of papers based on the impactfulness, if that's a word, of the authors or the institution, we don't do that. I honestly don't care where you're from, as long as the work's fantastic, I'm not bothered. So I think, yeah, I think everyone else has said everything else. You know, there's been lots of research on COVID and virtual issues and different things this year, which is really valuable and interesting. And that isn't all we're interested in, all journals are interested in now. You know, think about the big picture in the long term and getting your papers published. And take advice from other people before you submit. I think especially as an early career researcher, it was good advice. I think Chris put the slide up about aiming for the top. There's no point sending your paper to some journals, and there's no point, you know, I don't send my papers to some journals because I'm not going to get in them. You know, you learn that the hard way, but it does hold you up a lot. And as Joe said, most papers are publishable in the right outlet. So yeah, I think everyone said everything else I had to say. So I might just stop there actually, Luke, if that's okay.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Bruce.
I am going to unshare. Just give me a second.
No, that's great. It's great to see as well, like some comments popping up in the chat, and some of the speakers are starting to answer. We'll bring those after Olivia's presentation, because I don't think the chat's recorded. So obviously for those who aren't attending today, they'll be able to see those questions as well, but that's great. But finally, we have Professor Olivia Wu. Olivia is a Professor of Health Technology Assessment and a Director of the HEHGA Research Unit at the University of Glasgow. And she is also the Director of the National Institute for Health Research, a Complex Review Support Unit, a National Method Support Unit for the Evidence Synthesis. In addition to her research, Olivia has been a long-standing member of the NICE Technology Appraisal Committee and is an advisor to Healthcare Improvement Scotland. And Olivia is the Associate Editor of Value in Health. So over to you, Olivia.
Okay, so can you see my slides okay?
Yes, that's great.
Right, brilliant. Okay, so there is very little I can add to what's already been said. So being the last presenter has a slight disadvantage, or advantage if you like. I can just be very brief. I'm the associate editor for Value in Health. So what I will do is I'll just tell you a bit more about our journal. Right, so Value in Health, we have two editors-in-chief, Mike Drummond and Dan Mullins, and what we publish and what we focus on are articles for pharmacoeconomics, health economics, and outcomes research. We're interested in conceptual and health policy articles as well. So we're interested in methodological work and also applied work. If you like, I think that what Value in Health focuses on, which differs from some of the other journals, is probably more health technology assessment focused than health economics, for instance. So we talk a lot about impact factor. So the current impact factor for Value in Health is about 4.7. And for those of you who are wondering, you know, where does this metric come from? And to calculate impact factor is based on the total citations divided by the total number of articles published in the past 2 years. I think impact factor is a metric that is commonly used, and it is obviously good to have a CV full of high impact factor journals, but don't let that dictate where you submit your work and what you do, because ultimately it's about the quality of your work that's matter. So if you think about how researchers are judged, we currently are being judged by the Research Excellence Framework, which happens every 5 years, the REF. And I sit on the REF panel, and I can share with you that impact factor is not a strong driving factor in how we score papers. It is really down to the quality of the research. So if it is a very good quality piece of work that is highly relevant, novel, and has potential impact to contribute to the field or to change, improve patient care, then those papers will be scored highly regardless of where it's been published. So while I think we should be mindful of impact factor, but don't let that dictate where you publish. So some key statistics for value in health. Last year we received more than 1,600 manuscripts, and 65% of them were desk rejected. Our overall rejection rate is about 82 to 84%. So the acceptance rate is very similar to what Bruce and Joe have talked about earlier. Our average time from submission to first decision is relatively quick. So 97% of the manuscripts we receive will get a first decision within 3 months, and 89% within 2 months. But I must confess that over the last 12 months during the pandemic, the time to decision may have been a bit longer, because it has been quite challenging trying to get reviewers to try and review our papers, because everybody's been pulled in different directions and everybody's workload seems to be escalating during the past 12 months. So that ultimately have had an impact on time from submission to decision. So what does the editor look for in a paper? So what the editor wants to see is a paper that aligns with the journal scope. So it is something within our interest. Is it a novel contribution? You know, it doesn't have to be potentially Nobel Prize winning or change the world, but but it has to add to the field. It has to have added value to what we currently know. So it is important that there's a clear differentiation from work that's been previously done. So, for example, if you're to say this is a first cost study conducted in the UK, but that's just not enough. So it's got to be a genuinely useful contribution. We publish a lot of evaluations. So one thing that we always ask is whether the comparators and the methods used are appropriate. So that's something that we quickly look at if it's an economic evaluation. The data that's being used to inform your work doesn't match the research question you're trying to answer. We're also looking for any potential bias or marketing message. So we're not interested in that. And also, we also are interested in papers that are well written. So the use of language and grammar is important, because papers that are really difficult to read do not put you in a good stead for positive response, because often if it is really poorly written, then the message is lost. So it is important to make sure that your paper is well written. And if we do send it out to reviewers, this is what we ask our reviewers to think about. We ask the reviewers to evaluate the scientific merit of the overall paper. And we want constructive feedback from reviewers. We don't want them to just say that they don't like it, it's terrible. We want to understand, why, if they don't like it, why, and how could it be better? And it also indicates whether it merits an editorial. So we ask the reviewer whether the paper is so good that we should invite an editorial to go alongside it. And we ask the reviewers to make a recommendation on whether we should ask the authors to revise, accept, or reject. Now, typically in Value in Health, we would want 3 reviewers to review our paper. And I noticed somebody has asked, why do you sometimes have 2 reviewers feedback and sometimes you have 3? So what we do in practice is we normally go and ask maybe 5 or 6 in the hope that that some of them will be busy or some of them may not want to review for whatever reason. So at the end, we hope to get 3 reviewers, but sometimes we might not be able to get that. And you get reviews back from 2 reviewers that are relatively consistent and there's enough in their reviews and feedback to help you make a decision. So instead of delaying the process, what we'll do then is to go ahead and make a decision based on that. However, if the reviews are really conflicted in terms of the recommendation and as an editor you feel that it'll be helpful to get another opinion, then we'll probably wait for feedback from the 3rd reviewer to help us make that decision. So together, this is what we're looking for in assessing these papers. Is the research question appropriately justified? Is there a real gap in the evidence base that this paper is filling? The statistical analysis, does it match the research question and the study design? We also want to see whether the results and the discussion sections are fairly balanced. So, whatever your conclusions are should be based on the results from your study. And we want to make sure that we see the authors explain the relevance and the importance of the findings appropriately. And we want to see all limitations acknowledged appropriately. So, no matter how good your piece of work is, there's always limitations to consider. So we want the authors to have thought through and declare them appropriately. And also whether the results are placed in the context of the existing literature. So, so it's tying it back to the justification of your research question. So once you've got your conclusions, how does this then fill the gap that you have identified? So the common problems that we see in Value in Health, poor writing is one of them. And then the second one is a lack of novel contribution. And it just, it seems to be repeating what somebody else have done. The methods not matching the study question. So that's another common problem. And lack of transparency is an issue. So if you say you have used a certain software program or run certain codes and this is what you've got, that's not enough. We really need to have clear description on the methods, on the underlying assumptions and so on. Another common problem is selection bias not adequately addressed. So that's very common in economic evaluations, and also not having the right comparator is something that we often see, and also the absence of any acknowledgement of limitations. So that's another problem. So editor's pet peeve. So I must say this comes from, this is really things that my colleagues have often shared with when we get together. So the use of introduction as a means to introduce random facts and trivia. So the introduction section really is for you to summarize existing evidence, and it should be supported by evidence. It shouldn't just be one's opinion or just random facts. So that really, I think that would really annoy the editor if you haven't have a really evidence-based reason for justifying your research question. Very often we see non-statistically significant results being described as trending towards significance. So that's really kind of pushing the interpretation of your results. The introduction of new concepts in the conclusion section, again, is something that that is not going to be helpful, because the conclusion should really be drawn from your own study, from your results. So so introducing something that's new, that's not really supported by your results, is again not going to be helpful. And also references that you use in your papers, if they're not up to date, again, that's not going to be contributing to a positive response from the editor or the reviewer. So these are things that you should really be thinking about when you're writing your paper. So I've talked about things that we don't like, but I want to really show you an example of things that we do like. So Value in Health, every year we award a paper of the year. These papers are nominated by associate editors and editors, and then we vote. So 2019, the paper of the year was by Monica Hernandez on EQ5D5L versus 3L. So this is a really nice example of a paper that we think is of top quality. The 2020 the paper has been decided, but it's not been announced yet. So this is why I'm showing you the 2019 paper. So I would encourage you all to have a look at this paper as an example of, of really good writing for publication. So once you've submitted and it's been reviewed, 3 possible results: rejection, you may be invited to revise your paper, or an acceptance. And I think the other speakers have already talked about what the top tips are. So I think mine are very similar. If you're asked to revise the paper, do put effort into that. It's always good practice to prepare a point-by-point response to reviewers' comments. If reviewers, I think Bruce have said that, often make very good recommendations. So you should just consider them and do them. But there are occasions when reviewers may have misunderstood what you're trying to say, and you wish to argue the point. Then by all means do that articulately, and perhaps it is a matter of you rewording what you've written rather than make substantial changes. So if you choose not to address a specific point, you need to provide a really good rationale for that. You then modify your manuscript and upload a clean and tracked version. That's what we want to see in Value in Health, and make sure you comply with the journal's instructions for authors. And I think if you've submitted revisions before, you may feel that it's quite tedious. There's lots of things to submit, lots of boxes to tick, but if you don't comply with them, it will only delay the process. So it is also helpful to you to make sure you read the small print and make sure you know what the editorial office is expecting of you when you resubmit. So things like authorship forms and conflict of interest forms and all that, make sure you upload all that to avoid delay. So in summary, what's important, I think, when thinking about submitting for publications: do your homework, look at the potential journals you're interested in and target the right journal. Tailor your paper to the journal. So there's lots of useful and helpful information on all the journals' website. So do read them and follow the instructions. Use the feedback from editors and reviewers to revise your papers accordingly, whether it's to resubmit to this same journal or to another journal. They're always only going to be helpful to enhance your paper. But the most important thing of all is to be resilient and persistent. Revise, resubmit, and repeat. Don't give up just because you've had a couple of rejections. If you've got a good piece of work, it will get published. So resistance and persistence is really the key. So that's all I have to say. So I hope we've got a lot of enough time to answer a lot of your questions, and I'll just stop here.
That's great, and thank you very much, Olivia. I'd like to thank Chris, Joe, and Bruce as well for some fantastic presentations. So it's nice to see that there's some comments coming up in the chat. Like I say, Bruce, Olivia, and Joe started to respond to some of these, but I'll ask them again just so that those who haven't seen the chat and those who will be watching this recording at a later time. So one of the first questions was directed to Chris, saying, thank you for your presentation, Chris. Interested whether there's a movement to ensure more diversity in publishing research papers, i.e. from different universities, female researchers, or from lower to middle income countries.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Bruce had put on the chat there, that definitely is within Springer Nature a big influence on increasing diversity, not only in terms of papers that we publish, but also our editorial board as well. We're starting to set some targets for 50% women on our editorial board, for example. It's quite hard to find people from Africa to be on the editorial board. I think we do struggle to find suitable people, but we're certainly looking to increase diversity on the board and in terms of the papers we publish.
I think I'd agree with that with Chris. I mean, we have more females than males on the overall on health economics if you include the associate editors. But we have a lot of associate editors, of course. We have 40 odd, and that changes each year because people come and go. But that's been a more recent thing with health economics journals, I think, as well. And there's a lot more work to be done. But on the international front as well, of course, there's language barriers. So there's a lot of people in Africa don't speak English, and it's not their first language, and so they don't publish in English language journals. South America, of course, the same. A lot of Asian countries as well. So it's not that we don't encourage papers or editors or reviewers from certain areas. They're just not there, and they're not working in this area. But I know Wiley are trying. I presume the other publishers are trying. I'm not pushing for Wiley here. I know other publishers are trying hard as well, because there's a big market there, of course, and a lot of money in certain countries. So. But it's definitely an issue, and I know we're working hard on it, and I know Sally, our editor-in-chief, is working really hard on this behind the scenes as well. But a lot of the journals don't have data as well, so that's one thing that they're trying to push on, is collecting the data on who the authors are, where they're from, because it's not immediately obvious sometimes who authors are. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but you can still look at some, especially economics journals, and inclusivity is not obviously at the top of their agenda. I'll leave it there as we're being recorded.
So in value in health, we are doing that, looking at the data, as Bruce was talking about. We have data. So this is tied in with the Women in Health Economics and Outcomes Research Initiative through ISPOR. So I co-lead the initiative, and one thing that we are planning to do now, alongside Nancy Devlin is to look at our data and try and look at whether we are doing better in terms of diversity amongst the authors who are submitting. What motivated this initially was to look at the COVID impact on women, whether we are seeing less submissions from women because of the pandemic, because a lot of women have been working from home, and with the schools having been off, they have a lot of home responsibilities that resulted in them not being able to be as productive as they like. So this is what motivated it, and I think what Bruce has said about people from different countries, trying to allocate gender, if you like, to names has been very, very difficult. We found some clever algorithms from the internet that will help us with certain ethnicity groups. So we don't know how successful that will be yet, but this is one of the projects that is in the pipeline. So we are actively thinking about these issues.
Yeah, and I would say the same for social science and medicine, and Elsevier have also been doing work looking at the impact on women in the pandemic, and we do have data on country of submission, and we do look at that each year in our editorial boards, and the numbers are going up, but it's very gradual, and I think that's for a lot of the reasons that Bruce has sort of highlighted.
No, that's great. I saw that Samuel Shukut had raised your hand. Did you have a question?
Hi, thanks. I did have a question about quality of reporting checklists. Some journals are asking reviewers to use these checklists, such as that one from Cheers or the second panel. Equator provides a lot of them. And these are useful, but they're often not appropriate to the paper or up to date. And to be consistent between statistics and study design, Cheers and second panel don't mention regression approaches to cost effectiveness analysis. And digging deeper, Strobe could mention mediation or collider stratification bias alongside confounding and effect modification. So how do editors feel about developing our own checklists, noting modifications to checklists? Is that kind of the expectation of reviewers anyway? To develop some sort of checklist when reviewing a paper?
So for social science and medicine, we don't ask people to complete checklists as part of the journal submission. The only area where there is a checklist specifically mentioned is around qualitative research, and that isn't one of the standard ones actually. So we don't tend to use them specifically.
So I think checklists is quite a big industry, developing checklists, and I think we have a lot of checklists out there for everything already. So our journal does ask people to fill in the Cheers checklist, but that is not really the only piece of tool you make your judgment. I mean, those checklists are helpful for reviewers and editors because I think if you fail in a lot of the criteria on those checklists, as an author, you already know that you really need to improve your paper before you're submitting. So it's a good exercise, I think, to ask the authors to do that. But you're absolutely right that some studies do not really fit snugly into what the checklists are asking, and that's absolutely fine. And all you need to do is to really write a note on why for that particular item it's not a simple yes or no. Because decisions are not purely just made from whether you take yes on all the items on the checklist. So it's just another piece of tool to help us in reviewing your paper. I personally don't really feel I have the motivation for another checklist because I think there is never going to be a perfect checklist for everything, and is a useful tool to set some kind of minimum threshold, but ultimately you need to read the paper and make your own judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, with the Cheers 2, which we're working on at the moment, we're talking about it as a minimum set of requirements, and they're there as an aid to help you develop a fully fully detailed paper that'll be able to go to review. They're just there as an aid.
Yeah, we don't use them. We I think publish across too broad a range to have it. We'd need several checklists, and that would become too confusing for me, especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Equator Network's a really good resource just to go and see what's there and what might match what you're writing about.
No, that's great. And then another question from the chat was, to Chris, could you provide examples of common intellectual conflicts of interest? And everyone else has any words as well.
Oh, I think Joe quite nicely answered that in the chat box. I mean, for example, if you've developed a career on developing a particular type of instrument such as IceCap, or you've you made your career on developing a particular method, such as best worst scaling or promoting a particular method of economic evaluation or whatever, then that should be declared.
No, that's great. And there's also a question saying, curious about the value of being an associate or assistant editor to, for academic promotion versus just publishing and reviewing regularly for journals.
I think personally, when when I've seen promotion applications go through, I think it's of higher standing to be involved with an editorial board in some way than it is to review papers. I think there's a hierarchy. You should be reviewing for journals. That would be normal, I think, to get promoted. But then once you become an editor, you do less reviewing because it's just you haven't got time. So I guess it's that trade-off. But certainly, if someone was an editor, if it's like a job application, if someone puts on their CV that they're an associate editor for a journal and someone else isn't, that's a brownie point for them, I think. So I think it's definitely something to consider. It does take up a lot of time. So, but I guess you don't get invited to do these things till you've published a certain number of papers anyway. One thing I think Sonia was mentioning something. I don't know why I'm pointing at the chat because you can't see it. But she mentioned about early career researchers being, I think probably Sonia can speak for herself, of course, but becoming a more integral part of journals as well and being considered as first authors. And maybe we're also thinking about things like getting early career researchers more involved with certain processes involved with the journal as well, and getting more feedback from people rather than just having, because when you ask people for comments, you get the same people commenting on stuff often. So, this group as well, as I said, we're not just saying we'd like feedback, and I'm sure all the journal editors would in different ways. We would actually like that feedback and find out how things could improve and change and why you're not submitting to journals and what's putting you off from doing that, and not just how we can help and what the process is, but if you're not submitting, why aren't you submitting? Why are you submitting to different journals? It'd be really interesting to know. Maybe that's something for the early career researcher group to work on. You don't have, you might not want to say out loud why you're not doing it, but maybe as a group you could find out what the barriers are and what journals could do about it, and then tell us, because we don't work for the well, some of us do, but we don't work for the publishers. We're academics who work for universities and want to help the early career researchers get on. So maybe that's something the group could consider as an idea of finding out what we could do differently and what's stopping you doing certain things. Maybe.
No, that's great. There's another question which started to get answered really well in the chat, but I'll bring it to the group now as well. Is a question to Chris and to all. I can see why impactful authors / institutions might make a decision easier for an editor and be in the short-term interest of the publisher in terms of impact factor, but can you justify this a little bit more? Doesn't this reduce the chances of people who don't have the right networks or credentials? Shouldn't papers be assessed on their own merits rather than reinforcing existing criteria, citation bias? Would be interesting to hear from the other journals on this too. The advice given appears to be perverse incentives in terms of inviting co-authors. To me, this just increases the case for triple blind review, where even the editors don't know who the authors are.
Yeah, I read that question. I think what I want to say is that primarily it is about the paper. I want to clarify that. But if there's a decision which is pretty borderline and there are high impactful authors on that author list, that may sway the decision. What I'm trying to say is that I do think it has some impact, together with a number of different factors, in making a decision about whether to send a paper to review if an editor is unsure or it's 50-50 on the paper. So I'm not saying it's a primary decision factor, but I think certainly some of my colleagues on other Springer journals, it does play in their mind the authors and the author list. The question of single blind, double blind, triple blind review. I'm not convinced that you can truly double blind paper in a small field such as health economics. Quite often reviewers will say, oh yes, we know who the authors are. I'm not convinced that double blind review would actually works fully in a small area, a small field. And I don't think there's any evidence to show that it improves the quality of papers. So yeah.
Does anybody else have anything to add there?
Not that hasn't been already said, I think, in terms of it's just, I mean, our associate editors make a lot of the decisions on accepts and rejects for the mass of the papers, and I don't think they know who the authors are, the referees don't, but I don't think they would, I mean, who knows subliminally what's happening, you know, but I don't think there's no instruction to go for bigger impact authors to get more citations or anything.
Yeah, and I'm not.
Anyway.
Yeah,
Might
I'm not
change.
saying I'm not saying that that's overt or specific, but I think it can play in people's editor's mind subliminally.
Yeah, it probably does. It might play on minds to say, "Oh, I'd better send that out because someone supposedly important," but they're not really important. These people. And the papers they write are usually stuff you've read elsewhere anyway. It's much better to get something new and interesting.
No, that's great. So another question asked was, would paper submitted to HESG count as a working paper for SSM? And Joe answered in the chat saying that no, they wouldn't count because they're hidden behind a password and only available to members of HESG. And another question put to Bruce was, why do some papers get sent out to 2 or 3 reviewers? And the response back there was that it's usually sent out to more, and then it's then the reviewers who get their responses back quickest. Does anyone want to add to there, or should we move on? No.
I would just add about, sorry,
yeah, sorry, Chris.
No, Joe, were you going to say something? Sorry.
I was just going to say that the reality is that it's very difficult to get reviewers, and I will often send them out to 6, 7, 8, 15 people in the end to get 2 reviews. So you know, sometimes by chance you might get 3. You know, you might be very lucky and 3 reviews might come back. What we work to is having 2 reviews, at least 2 reviews, and sometimes the review may not be adequate. You know, you may get a review that's like 3 lines and you think, well, I can't really use that as a justification one way or another, and so I will send it to someone else then. That's just to expand on what I said in the chat.
I just wanted to add 2 points. One, about the preprints thing. Springer Nature across all their journals actively encourage preprints and authors to post preprints. So it's certainly not something that we would preclude in terms of for peer review. And then the point about Joe made, some of my clinical editor colleagues who manage lower tier journals, they're having to send out to 50, 60, even 70 reviewers to get 2 or 3 acceptance reviewers. So yeah, it can be quite tough.
No, that's great. So another question was do PharmacoEconomics and Value and Health allow for the indications of managing editor by the authors? I see that Health Economics does that, and Joe mentioned the allocation across editors is random for SSM.
Do you want to answer that, Olivia, or do you want me to? For PharmacoEconomics, we have 2 full-time editors-in-chiefs, and they're the ones that manage all the papers. So, and we sit next to each other. So, yeah, I'm not sure random allocation would work for PharmacoEconomics because we're under a different model as to we don't have the associate editor model that the Value and Health has.
Yeah, so all the papers go to Mike and Dan first, and then if they don't reject it, then it will come to the associate editors. So there are 27 of us, and And I don't think it's purely random allocation. They have a good idea of what all our expertise, where our expertise lie, and they try to allocate it according to our interests and expertise. But it doesn't always work out like that. So, for instance, they might send me a paper on evidence synthesis, but I feel that I'm conflicted, so then it will get randomly allocated to somebody else.
No, that's great. And another question was, what are the views on open research practices? Do you value pre-registrations, open data sharing, replication studies?
Well, I mean, we do promote data sharing, and we, particularly with economic evaluations, we actually struggle to get authors to even share the models with reviewers, never mind publishing them publicly. So I think the community is quite a long way from truly open data.
We also encourage that, and so the use of supplementary material to share your codes is always really good practice. I think it's difficult for journals to dictate that, but what you will find is funders would now become more and more strong in terms of asking you to have your work in open access and share your data publicly, especially if you're funded from NIHR or any other of the kind of public funders.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we don't mandate it, but we do offer it as an option, and it's generally good practice if it's possible. It's not always possible, depending on what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we even struggle to get people to share a full survey.
Yeah, we encourage supplementary material because, of course, everything's online, so there's nothing stopping anyone doing it apart from the fact that they don't want to do it. I think one thing that we haven't really talked about is open access fees as well. And I know some universities pay, some don't, and it's probably we haven't got that long to talk about all of these things, but that might be one barrier to submission for different journals as well, for early career researchers, and maybe something for the group to come back on to journals and to have a response as well on that, because some people haven't got access to funds, some have. There's a lot of inequity there, even within rich countries. Yeah, I'd certainly like to know a bit more about what the early career researcher groups think about that.
No, that's great. There are no other questions, and I'd say we've finished pretty much well on time. So I'd like to thank Chris, Joe, Olivia, and Bruce for your time, and hopefully this has been useful to everyone else who's attended, and thank you to all who have attended this session. It's nice to see the numbers throughout. So thank you very much.